Moving into the ancient Victorian house, we hoped for a fresh start. But from the first night, it became clear that the past wasn't ready to let go. Haley and I had gone through a tough couple of years, and the idea of fixing up and living in a historic home was both exciting and a bit scary. The house had been standing for over a century, holding all kinds of secrets from its past. From the moment we walked through the creaky front door, the house felt alive. The air smelled like old wood and something else I couldn't quite place. We spent our days unpacking and planning the renovations, and our nights huddled together under the high, shadowy ceilings. The first few nights were peaceful, but then the whispers started. One night I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, except for the occasional groan of the old timber. Then I heard it, a soft murmur, almost like the wind. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the sound didn't go away. I nudged Haley, who was half asleep, and she listened too. Her startled expression told me she heard it too. We lay there, straining to catch the words, but they were too faint. It was like the house itself was talking, a gentle, sad sigh drifting through the walls. The next day, we went up to the attic, where we thought the whispers were coming from. The staircase creaked as we climbed, and dust swirled in the flashlight's light. The attic was like a time capsule, filled with old relics and furniture covered in white sheets. We didn't find anything that could explain the whispers, just the eerie quiet of an untouched space. Over the next few weeks, the whispers got louder and more distinct. We could almost make out words, bits of conversation carried on the air. It was clear they were coming from the attic. Haley and I spent countless nights huddled together, listening to the voices. The whispers started to tell a story of love and loss, a tragic romance that seemed to echo through time. Wanting to find out the truth, we began looking into the house's past. We discovered it had belonged to a young couple, Charles and Lillian, who lived there in the early 1900s. Their love story was legendary, passionate but doomed. Lillian had fallen ill, and Charles, unable to bear life without her, met a tragic fate. Lillian, heartbroken, followed him soon after. They died in the attic, their love forever trapped within the house. The more we learned, the louder the whispers got. They weren't just whispers anymore, but clear voices. We could hear their conversations, their declarations of love and their cries of despair. It felt like Charles and Lillian were still there, reliving their final moments over and over again. One night, the whispers became unbearable. The voices were louder than ever before. We could make out every word, every sob and plea. I felt a shiver when I realized the voices were not just echoes from the past. They were speaking to us. Haley and I exchanged terrified glances. The voices were desperate, filled with longing and sorrow. We knew we had to do something, but we didn't know what. The house had a hold on us, tightening its grip with each passing day. Determined to confront the spirits, we made our way to the attic. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers surrounded us, urging us on. As we reached the top of the stairs, the voices went silent. The attic was dark and still, but we could feel their presence, a weight in the air. I called into the dark, telling them we knew their story and wanted to help. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a cold breeze swept through the attic, and the whispers returned, soft and sad. "We want to be together," they said. "We need you." As the words echoed around us, Haley suddenly clutched her chest, gasping for air. Her eyes stared blankly, and she began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, describing details of Charles and Lillian's life that we had never read or heard about. The shocking truth became clear. We weren't just hearing their story, we were living it. The spirits of Charles and Lillian weren't just reliving their love story. They were trying to possess us, to use our bodies to reunite in the physical world. The realization sent a wave of fear through me, but it also made me more determined. I told Haley we couldn't let them take over. We had to fight this. Haley nodded, her face pale but determined. We held each other tightly, grounding ourselves in the present, in our love for each other. The voices grew louder, more insistent, but we resisted. We spoke words of love and hope, drowning out the whispers with our own voices. Hours passed, and gradually the whispers began to fade. The air grew warmer, and the feeling of dread faded away. By dawn, the attic was silent again. We had broken the cycle, freeing ourselves and the spirits trapped in the house. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less menacing. We continued our renovations, but the house no longer seemed alive with secrets. Charles and Lillian's story had been laid to rest, their voices finally at peace. But as we settled into our new life, I started to notice something strange. Haley was changing. At first it was subtle. She began to speak in an old-fashioned manner, using words and phrases that seemed out of place. She spent hours in the attic, saying she felt drawn to it. I grew increasingly worried, realizing that while we thought we had freed the spirits, they had merely found a new host. One evening, I confronted her in the attic. She stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. I asked her what was happening to her. She turned to me, and for a moment, I saw not my partner but someone else, someone from another time. "We're here," she whispered, her eyes filled with a strange light. "We never left." The truth dawned on me, leaving me cold and breathless. Charles and Lillian hadn't been trying to possess us both. They only needed one. They had succeeded, and now Haley was gone, her body a vessel for Lillian's restless spirit. Over the next few weeks, I fought to bring Haley back, but the whispers continued, now a constant presence in our lives. The house, once a symbol of hope, had become a prison. And as the days turned into nights, I knew that our story had become part of the house's dark history, another chapter in its endless cycle of love and loss. I always imagined our first weekend getaway together would mix peace and adventure. When Valerie suggested a remote cabin deep in the woods, it seemed perfect. We both needed a break from the city's noise and chaos. Driving through winding roads with tall trees on both sides, we felt excited and calm. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by a dense forest. It was small and rustic, making it feel timeless. We unpacked, settled in, and spent the afternoon exploring. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the wind and occasional bird calls. As the sun set, the forest grew darker, and the atmosphere became a bit eerie. That first night, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just a flicker of the lights, a slight creak of the floorboards. I thought it was just the quirks of an old cabin, but Valerie seemed more uneasy. She pointed out that the lights flickered in a pattern, almost like Morse code. I laughed it off, saying she was being paranoid. The next morning, Valerie found her favorite book lying open on the kitchen table, even though she remembered packing it in her bag. Objects started to move on their own, but only when we weren't looking. A chair would shift a few inches, a door would be slightly open. It felt as if the cabin had a life of its own, and it was watching us. We tried to brush off these strange happenings, telling ourselves we were just on edge from being in an unfamiliar place. But as the day went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. The lights no longer flickered. They would turn off completely, leaving us in darkness for several seconds before flickering back to life. I began to notice subtle sounds, footsteps, whispers, the rustling of leaves, even though there was no wind. On the second night, the power went out completely. With flashlights in hand, we stumbled through the cabin, searching for the breaker box. While looking through a closet, Valerie found a hidden door behind a stack of firewood. It was small, barely noticeable, but once we saw it, we couldn't ignore it. We opened the door to find a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. As we went down, the air grew colder, and a strong sense of dread washed over me. The basement was filled with old furniture, dusty books, and boxes of forgotten belongings. But what caught our attention was the wall of monitors showing live feeds of every room in the cabin, including the basement. Our blood ran cold as we realized we were being watched. Each screen showed a different angle of us, capturing our every move. There were cameras hidden in places we hadn't even thought of, behind picture frames, inside light fixtures in the walls. We stood there, frozen in horror, trying to understand the situation. We knew we had to get out, but as we turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut. The monitors flickered, and a distorted voice came through a hidden speaker. It said we were the stars of a reality TV show, broadcasting live to millions of viewers. The show thrived on our fear and confusion, and there was no escape. Panic set in. We pounded on the door, screamed for help, but no one heard us. The voice taunted us, detailing our every move and reaction. It knew our secrets, our fears, and it used them against us. The lights in the basement began to flicker, plunging us into intermittent darkness. Each time the lights came back on, the basement seemed to shift slightly, objects moving closer, creating a maze-like effect. In a desperate bid for freedom, we smashed one of the monitors, hoping to disrupt the surveillance system. The voice grew angrier, the lights flickering more wildly. We found a crowbar among the clutter and used it to pry open the door. With all our strength, we managed to break it open and raced up the stairs. The cabin was in chaos. The lights were flashing, alarms blaring. We grabbed our belongings and fled into the night, not daring to look back. The forest, once a haven, now seemed like a labyrinth designed to trap us. We stumbled through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin, driven by sheer terror. After what felt like hours, we reached our car. We sped away, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. There, we went straight to the police and reported our ordeal. The officers listened, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism, but they agreed to investigate. The next day, they took us back to the cabin. As we walked through the familiar forest, dread crept over us. When we arrived, it was shocking. The cabin looked untouched. There were no cameras, no monitors, no sign of any reality TV setup. We showed the police the hidden door in the closet and led them down to the basement, but it was empty too. Everything was as if our terrifying experience had been erased. The police found nothing unusual and suggested we might have been victims of a cruel prank or our own imaginations. It was as if the entire place had been a mirage, a nightmare designed just for us. Exhausted and shaken, we returned to our daily lives, but things were never the same. We couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the safety of our own home. Then one evening, we found a note slipped under our door. It read, "You can't escape the show. We are always watching." Our blood ran cold. The reality set in. We were still part of the show. Our every move was being monitored, our lives exploited for entertainment. The cameras were everywhere, hidden in places we couldn't even begin to imagine. We were trapped in a never-ending nightmare, our fears manipulated. In the end, we realized the true horror wasn't the cabin itself, but the constant surveillance and manipulation of our lives. And somewhere, out there, someone was still watching. We were still in the show, our lives a constant source of entertainment for millions, with no way out. You never know who might be watching. Even now, as you watch this. The house had stood for over a century, its walls holding the stories of generations past. When I first saw it, the old and weathered look seemed like an opportunity, a blank canvas ready to be transformed into a home. The renovation was extensive, but I was ready. What I wasn't ready for was the discovery that would turn my dream home into a place of nightmares. It started on a clear morning. The sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I decided to tackle the upstairs bedrooms, hoping to reveal the original hardwood floors hidden beneath the old carpet. With tools in hand and a determined spirit, I pried up the boards. That's when I found it. A small, leather-bound diary, tucked away under a loose floorboard, as if hidden deliberately. Curiosity got the better of me. I dusted off the cover and opened it. The handwriting was neat and meticulous, The entries were dated from the late 1970s, and as I read the first page, I felt a shiver run through me. The diary belonged to a woman named Alina, a previous owner of the house. Her entries started off simply, talking about the joys and challenges of owning a home, but as the pages turned, the tone changed. Alina wrote about a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being watched. She described how she would catch glimpses of shadows out of the corner of her eye, always disappearing when she turned to look directly. At first, she dismissed these occurrences as her imagination, much like I was tempted to do. But her entries became more frantic, detailing how the sensation of being watched intensified, how she could feel eyes on her even in the most private moments. I closed the diary, my heart racing. It's just a story, I told myself, a figment of someone's paranoid imagination. But as the days went by, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling deep inside me. I began to feel it too, the prickling sensation of eyes on me, the fleeting shadows that seemed to vanish the moment I tried to focus on them. One evening, as I was painting the living room, I felt it again, that unmistakable sense of being watched. I turned abruptly, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. I gave a nervous laugh, kicking myself for letting an old diary affect me. Determined to shake off the irrational fear, I continued with my work. Days passed into weeks, and the renovation moved forward. Yet, the feeling persisted. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my nights plagued by restless sleep and unsettling dreams. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noises, shadows move with the shifting light. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. One sleepless night, I found myself drawn back to Alina's diary. I needed to understand her experiences, hoping to find some explanation that would put my mind at ease. Her final entries were the most disturbing. She wrote about hearing whispers in the night, voices she couldn't understand, but they filled her with dread. She described finding objects moved from their places, doors she was certain she had locked standing ajar. The last entry was the most chilling of all. Alina wrote about seeing a figure in the garden, watching her through the window. She said its face was hidden in shadows, hard to make out. But the sense of evil it gave off was clear. She ended the entry with a plea, hoping that whoever found her diary would understand the danger she was in. I set the diary down, my hands trembling. I felt an odd bond with Alina, connected by our shared fear. But unlike Alina, I was determined to find out what was happening. The next day, I installed security cameras around the house, hoping to catch any intruders. It made me feel safer, if only slightly. For a few nights, nothing unusual happened. The cameras recorded hours of mundane footage, leaves rustling, branches swaying in the wind. But then, one night, I was awoken by the alarm, groggy and disoriented. I checked the footage. My blood ran cold. There, on the screen, was a figure standing in the garden, just as Alina had described. Its face was hidden in shadow, its posture menacing. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, before slowly turning and disappearing into the darkness. Desperation and fear gripped me. I knew I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I had to do something. My fear turned into determination. I would not be driven from my home. The next day, I showed the footage to the police. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but offered little else. Their skepticism was evident, and I couldn't blame them. It sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie. Despite their assurances, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I felt it during the day, at night, in every room of the house. I started to notice small things out of place, objects I was certain I hadn't moved, doors I knew I had locked standing open. My own paranoia mirrored Alina's descent into madness, and I struggled to hold on to my sanity. Driven by the need to confront my fear, and find some peace. I decided I had to face whatever was haunting me. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront the figure myself. I grabbed a can of pepper spray from my bedside table. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling, but I knew I had to do something. With a flashlight and pepper spray in hand, I waited by the window, my eyes scanning the garden. Hours passed, the darkness outside seeming to press against the glass. Just when I was about to give up, I saw it. A shadow moving through the trees. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, as I saw the figure peering through the window. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were searching the darkness inside. My breath caught in my throat as he moved away from the window and headed towards the front door. I listened intently, every muscle tense. The doorknob rattled, and I could hear the stranger trying to force it open. The sound of keys jangling followed, which puzzled me. How could he have keys to my house? The locks clicked, but to my relief, the door wouldn't budge. Earlier, I had installed a door jammer, and it was holding firm. The stranger's frustration was evident. He moved quickly around the house, his footsteps heavy on the wooden porch. I could hear him trying the back door next. The same sequence of sounds, the rattle of the knob, the clinking of keys, the click of the lock. But again, the door wouldn't open. Inside, my fear was mounting. Every nerve in my body screamed to hide, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The security measures I had taken were working, but for how long? The stranger's frustration was evident as he let out a low growl of anger. I clutched the can of pepper spray tightly, my hand shaking. The tension was overwhelming. Would he find a way in? What did he want? My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped. I heard his footsteps retreat, fading into the night. I waited, holding my breath, until I was sure he was gone. Then I called the police, my hands trembling as I dialed. The police arrived and searched the property, but their searches turned up nothing. No footprints, no evidence of any kind. It was as if the man had never existed, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew he would be back. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. It was no longer a home, but a den of fear. I packed my belongings and left, vowing never to return. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching me, his eyes following me, carrying the same evil that had driven Alina insane. The diary now sits in a box in my new apartment, a grim reminder of the horrors I faced. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel it, the sensation of being watched, the prickling on the back of my neck. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, a lingering fear from my time in that cursed house. But deep down, I know the truth. He's still out there, watching, waiting, and I fear he always will be.